Picture this. The year is 334 BC. The Persian Empire controls 3 million square miles, commands armies in the hundreds of thousands, and hasn't lost a major war in 200 years. They're so dominant that Greek city-states pay them tribute just to avoid annihilation. Then a 22-year-old kid from Macedonia shows up with 37,000 men, and a strategy so simple, so brutally effective, that it would destroy the greatest empire on earth in just 3 battles. The Persians didn't just lose, they were humiliated, psychologically broken, made to look like amateurs by a boy barely old enough to grow a beard. By the end of this video, you'll understand the single tactical innovation that made it all possible. You'll see how Alexander turned the Persian Empire's greatest strength into their fatal weakness, and you'll discover why this one strategy is still taught in military academies worldwide as the ultimate example of combined arms warfare. But here's what makes this story truly insane. The Persians knew Alexander's strategy. They had spies. They had battlefield reports. They watched him use the exact same tactic 3 times, and they still couldn't stop it. Because Alexander hadn't just invented a new formation, he had created a killing machine so perfect that even knowing what was coming didn't help. The strategy was called hammer and anvil, and it changed warfare forever. To understand how one strategy destroyed an empire, you need to understand what made the Persian military so dominant. Because the Persians weren't incompetent. They were the most successful military power in human history up to that point. The Persian way of war was built on a simple principle: cavalry supremacy. For 200 years, Persian horsemen had terrorized battlefields from Egypt to India. They were faster than infantry, hit harder than chariots, and could encircle and destroy any army foolish enough to face them in open battle. The Persian cavalry doctrine was brilliant in its simplicity. Use superior mobility to flank the enemy, surround them, cut off retreat, then systematically destroy the trapped force with arrows and charges. It had worked against the Greeks at Marathon. It had crushed rebellions across the empire. It was battle-tested, time-proven, and seemingly unstoppable. Infantry, in the Persian view, was essentially worthless, slow, vulnerable, good only for holding positions or absorbing arrows while the cavalry did the real killing. The idea that foot soldiers could defeat mounted warriors was laughable. Every Greek general for 200 years had accepted this reality. You couldn't beat Persian cavalry in open battle, so you didn't try. You fought in mountain passes like Thermopylae. You used terrain to neutralize their mobility. You avoided pitched battles at all costs. But Alexander looked at this conventional wisdom and saw something nobody else did: an exploitable weakness disguised as strength. Because cavalry, for all its speed and power, has one critical limitation: it can't hold ground. Horses can charge, retreat, maneuver, but they can't plant their feet and refuse to move. They can't create an immovable wall that says, "You shall not pass." Infantry can. Alexander's genius was recognizing that cavalry and infantry weren't competitors. They were complementary: the hammer and the anvil, the striker and the foundation. And if you combined them properly, you could create something more powerful than either alone. The Macedonian phalanx became Alexander's anvil. But this wasn't the phalanx your history teacher told you about. This was something new, something terrifying. Traditional Greek hoplites carried 8-foot spears and large shields. They fought in tight formation, shield overlapping shield, creating a mobile wall. It was effective defensively, but slow and vulnerable to flanking. Alexander's father, Philip II, had revolutionized this. The Macedonian phalanx carried sarissas, 18 to 20-foot pikes, so long that the first 5 ranks could all point their weapons forward simultaneously. Imagine facing a wall of spear points, 5 rows deep, each one capable of impaling you before you could get close enough to strike back. The sarissa phalanx wasn't just defensive, it was a porcupine made of bronze and murder. Cavalry couldn't charge it because horses instinctively refused to impale themselves on spikes. Infantry couldn't break it because you'd be killed 5 times before reaching the front rank. Arrows were largely ineffective because the phalanx could raise their pikes and create a roof of wood and steel. But here's the critical detail. The phalanx wasn't mobile. It moved slowly. It couldn't pursue. It couldn't flank. It was the anvil, immovable and deadly, but fundamentally reactive. That's where the hammer came in. Alexander's Companion Cavalry was the elite of the elite. 2,000 horsemen, mostly Macedonian nobility, who had trained together since childhood. each man equipped with a 12-foot lance, body armor, and a sword. Each one bonded to Alexander personally through years of shared combat. But it wasn't the equipment that made them special. It was the formation and the doctrine. The cavalry wedge, a triangle with Alexander always at the point. The geometry was perfect for penetration. Maximum force at the tip, spreading wider behind to protect flanks and exploit the breakthrough. And unlike Persian cavalry, which used bows and hit-and-run tactics, the companions used shock action, charge directly into the enemy line with lances leveled, break through, and keep going until you hit the enemy commander. This is the strategy that humiliated Persia. Hammer and anvil. Pin the enemy with the phalanx, strike with the cavalry, break their line, kill their commander, watch the army collapse. Simple, brutal, unstoppable. The Persians first experienced this at the Battle of Granicus River in 334 BC. A Persian force of 40,000, mostly cavalry, faced Alexander's 37,000. The Persians positioned themselves on high ground across a river, a defensive position that should have been unassailable. Alexander did what no rational commander would do. He ordered a frontal assault across the river, uphill into a prepared enemy position. His generals begged him to reconsider. It was suicide. The cavalry would be cut down, crossing the water. The phalanx would be slaughtered climbing the bank. Alexander attacked anyway, and the hammer and anvil strategy revealed its brilliance. The phalanx crossed first, forming up on the far bank under a hail of arrows. Men died. Units wavered. But the Sarissa wall held, creating a beachhead, an anchor point that the Persians couldn't dislodge. Then Alexander led the Companion Cavalry across, not in a line, in the wedge. He aimed at one specific point in the Persian cavalry formation and hit it with 2,000 horsemen moving at full gallop. The impact was catastrophic. Persian cavalry, used to skirmishing and maneuvering, suddenly faced a bronze avalanche that didn't slow down, didn't retreat, didn't stop. The wedge punched through their line like a fist through wet paper, and Alexander, at the tip of that wedge, went straight for the Persian commanders. He killed Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law, in personal combat, spitted him on his lance. Then Rusaces, a Persian satrap, charged Alexander from the side, sword raised for a killing blow. Alexander's bodyguard, Clytus the Black, saved him with a sword thrust that took off Rusaces' arm at the shoulder. The Persian noble fell, screaming, and Alexander kept going, kept killing, kept driving toward the center of the Persian formation. Within 30 minutes, the Persian cavalry broke. Not because they were losing. They were still numerically superior, but because their commanders were dead or fleeing, and the Macedonian wedge had shattered their cohesion. The Persian infantry, seeing their cavalry routed, simply melted away. The battle was over. Persian casualties, 4,000 dead, including most of their leadership. Macedonian casualties, fewer than 100. The Persians were stunned. This wasn't how battles were supposed to work. Cavalry was supposed to dominate. Infantry was supposed to be irrelevant. But Alexander had flipped the script, used infantry as the foundation and cavalry as the decisive blow, but the humiliation was just beginning. 2 years later at Issus, Darius III personally commanded 100,000 men against Alexander's 40,000. The King of Kings had learned from Granicus. He knew about the phalanx and the cavalry wedge. He positioned his forces carefully, using a river to break up Alexander's formations, placing his best infantry in the center. It didn't matter. Alexander used the exact same strategy. Phalanx in the center to pin the Persian infantry, cavalry wedge on the right to break through and hunt the king. Darius watched from his command chariot as the Macedonian wedge carved through his left wing like it was made of smoke. He saw Alexander, personally leading the charge, killing Persian nobles with mechanical efficiency. And for the first time in his life, the King of Kings felt fear. He ran, abandoned his army, his family, his treasure, fled so fast he left his royal chariot behind and switched to a horse. The psychological impact was devastating. The god king of Persia, the ruler of half the known world, had turned his back on a battlefield. Persian morale didn't just break, it shattered. Troops who had been holding their positions moments before simply stopped fighting and ran. The Battle of Issus ended with 20,000 Persian dead, and Darius's entire family captured. Alexander's losses were minimal. The hammer and anvil strategy had worked again, identically, against an enemy who knew it was coming. You'd think after 2 humiliating defeats, the Persians would have found a counter. They had 2 years to prepare for the final confrontation at Gaugamela, 2 years to study Macedonian tactics, 2 years to develop a response to the hammer and anvil. Darius tried everything. He chose a perfectly flat plain where his cavalry could maneuver freely. He leveled the ground to make it even better for mounted warfare. He assembled the largest army in ancient history, perhaps 200,000 men. He deployed scythed chariots to break up the phalanx. He positioned war elephants to terrify the Macedonian horses. If you're fascinated by military strategy and want to see how one tactical innovation changed history forever, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're breaking down the battles that shaped civilizations and the genius commanders who fought them. At Gaugamela, Alexander used the hammer and anvil strategy for the 3rd time, and the Persians still couldn't stop it. The battle opened with Darius sending his terror weapons forward, 200 scythed chariots designed to shred the Macedonian phalanx into meat. The Persians watched in satisfaction as the chariots rolled toward the stationary infantry. Then the phalanx did something unexpected. It opened gaps, corridors between units. The chariots rolled through empty space while light infantry, positioned specifically for this purpose, killed the drivers with javelins. The Persian cavalry charged both flanks, trying to encircle the Macedonians. The phalanx on the left held firm, refusing to break despite being outnumbered 3-1. The anvil was doing its job, absorbing pressure, holding ground, giving Alexander time to work. On the right, Alexander executed the strategy one more time. He marched his cavalry diagonally, away from the Persian center, creating a gap in their line. When Bessus, commanding the Persian left, pursued this apparent retreat, he stretched his formation too thin. Alexander saw the gap, wheeled his companion cavalry into wedge formation, and charged straight for Darius, just like at Granicus and Issus. The hammer struck the anvil with perfect precision. The wedge penetrated the Persian center, carved through the immortal guard, and drove toward the golden chariot where Darius stood. And for the 2nd time, Darius ran. The King of Kings, surrounded by his elite guard, with numerical superiority and perfect terrain, turned and fled when he saw Alexander coming. The Persian Empire didn't just lose at Gaugamela, it was psychologically destroyed. The army collapsed not because they were being defeated, but because their god-king was running away again. The same strategy, used the same way, had broken them for the 3rd time. Here's what makes the hammer and anvil strategy so brilliant. It's not complicated. It doesn't require technological superiority. It doesn't depend on tricks or deception. It's just perfect integration of 2 military assets, infantry and cavalry, working in synchronization. The phalanx fixes the enemy in place. Like an anvil, it doesn't move, doesn't retreat, just absorbs the impact. The enemy has to deal with it. They can't ignore a wall of 18-foot spikes. They have to commit forces to containing it. While they're focused on the anvil, the hammer strikes. The cavalry wedge hits wherever the enemy is weakest, wherever their attention is diverted. It penetrates, disrupts, and most importantly, hunts the enemy commander. Because Alexander understood something that most ancient generals didn't. In pre-modern warfare, armies were controlled by visual signals and personal leadership. Kill or scatter the commanders, and the army loses cohesion. It doesn't matter if you're winning on the flanks if your center has collapsed and your king is fleeing. The Persians never developed a counter to this strategy because there isn't one. You can't ignore the phalanx because it will advance and kill you. You can't ignore the cavalry because it will flank and kill you. And if you divide your forces to deal with both, you're creating the gaps that the wedge exploits. The only counter would have been better discipline, better coordination, and leaders willing to stand and die rather than flee. But the Persian system was built on the divine authority of the king. When the king ran, the army had no reason to die. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire essentially ceased to exist as a military power. Darius was murdered by his own nobles. Persian satraps surrendered without fighting. Cities opened their gates to Alexander without resistance. The humiliation was complete. 200 years of Persian military dominance ended because one Macedonian king perfected the integration of infantry and cavalry. The empire that had terrorized the Mediterranean, that had burned Athens, that had made kings bow and nations pay tribute, was broken by a strategy so simple that a modern sergeant could explain it in 5 minutes. But here's the really insane part. The hammer and anvil strategy didn't die with Alexander. It became the foundation of Western military doctrine for 2,000 years. The Romans used it. Legions as the anvil, cavalry as the hammer. Medieval knights used it. Infantry pike squares as the anvil, heavy cavalry as the hammer. Napoleon used it. Infantry in square or line as the anvil, cavalry charges as the hammer. Even in World War II, you can see echoes of it. Infantry holds the line, tanks break through and exploit. The specific tools changed, but the principle remained. Fix the enemy with one force, strike with another. Modern combined arms doctrine, the integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, is just the hammer and anvil strategy with more moving parts. You fix the enemy with one asset, strike with another, coordinate the timing to create maximum effect. Military historians argue about Alexander's greatest achievement. Some say it was his undefeated record, others point to the empire he built. But the real legacy is this strategy. The proof that different military assets, properly integrated and synchronized, create multiplication factors that pure numbers can't match. At Granicus, Alexander was outnumbered and attacking uphill across a river. He won. At Issus, he was outnumbered 2-1 against the King of Kings personally. He won. At Gaugamela, he was outnumbered perhaps 5-1 against the largest army ever assembled. He won. Same strategy. Every time. And the Persians, despite knowing what was coming, despite preparing for years, despite having every advantage, couldn't stop it. That's not just military victory. That's intellectual dominance. That's one man proving that doctrine and training beat numbers and tradition. That's the humiliation of an empire that thought it understood warfare, taught by a 25-year-old that they understood nothing. The Persian military system was built on assumptions. Cavalry beats infantry. Numbers beat strategy. Kings are divine, and therefore invincible. Alexander shattered every assumption with one integrated tactical system. He proved that infantry, properly equipped and trained, could be the decisive arm. He proved that strategy and coordination mattered more than raw numbers. And he proved that kings bleed and run just like normal men when someone comes for them with enough conviction. The Persian Empire never recovered its psychological dominance. Even after Alexander died and his empire fractured, the Persian successor states never regained their old confidence. They had been shown to be mortal, fallible, beatable. And it all came down to one strategy: hammer and anvil, cavalry and phalanx, strike and hold. Simple enough that a child could understand it. Powerful enough to destroy the greatest empire on earth. That's the genius of Alexander. He didn't need complex plans or brilliant deceptions. He created a system so fundamentally sound that even when enemies knew what was coming, they couldn't stop it. Because stopping it would require better discipline, better training, better leadership, and better integration of forces than the Macedonians had. And nobody in the ancient world was better trained or better led than Alexander's army. The Persian Empire learned this the hard way. 3 times, 3 battles, 3 humiliating defeats using the exact same strategy. By the end, Persian soldiers were surrendering at the rumor of Alexander's approach, not because they were cowards, but because they had seen what happened when armies stood against the hammer and anvil. They had watched their cavalry, the pride of the empire, shattered by a phalanx they couldn't break. They had seen their infantry, standing firm and brave, suddenly flanked by a cavalry wedge moving faster than thought. They had witnessed their commanders, noble and skilled, cut down by a young Macedonian who seemed to see through all defenses. The psychological wound never healed. Alexander didn't just conquer Persia militarily, he broke them conceptually, proved that their entire way of war was obsolete, that centuries of tradition and proven tactics meant nothing against superior doctrine and execution. That's how you humiliate an empire, not by barely beating them, not by getting lucky once, but by using the same strategy 3 times against enemies who know it's coming, and winning so decisively that they stop believing in their own system. The hammer and anvil. Simple, brutal, perfect. The strategy that ended an empire and wrote the playbook for 2,000 years of warfare. Alexander's true legacy isn't the territory he conquered. It's the proof that one person, with the right strategy and the courage to execute it perfectly, can change the world. The Persians learned that lesson in blood and shame, and the rest of history took notes.